A 12-year-old boy became King of England and vanished without a trace 6 months later. Edward V disappeared inside the Tower of London in 1483, and his uncle Richard had everything to gain from his death. 5 centuries have passed, yet no one knows exactly how this child king died, only that he never emerged from those stone walls alive. The official story claims Edward V was placed in the tower for his own protection. The reality was far more sinister. Palace records from 1483 show that Edward and his younger brother were seen less and less frequently as the months passed, until witnesses stopped reporting sightings entirely. Contemporary accounts describe a boy who went from preparation for his coronation to complete isolation within a matter of weeks. What happened to Edward V wasn't just a simple murder. It was the systematic erasure of a child who stood between his uncle and absolute power. The methods used remain a mystery, but historical evidence points to deliberate starvation or suffocation chosen specifically because they left no obvious wounds that could later implicate the perpetrator. This wasn't a crime of passion or political necessity. It was calculated elimination disguised as protection. You won't find these details in most history textbooks, which prefer to treat the princes in the tower as an unsolved mystery rather than confront the brutal reality of what medieval power struggles meant for children caught in their path. But the surviving documents tell a different story, one of a 12-year-old king who trusted the wrong person and paid with his life. Edward V never asked to be king. Born in 1470 to Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville, he spent his childhood understanding that the crown would eventually be his burden, but nothing prepared him for how quickly that burden would destroy him. When his father died suddenly in April 1483, Edward was living in Ludlow Castle, hundreds of miles from London, completely unaware that his uncle was already planning to steal his throne. The transition should have been straightforward. Edward IV had ruled successfully for over a decade, and his eldest son was the undisputed heir. But the Woodville family, Edward's maternal relatives, had made powerful enemies during Edward IV's reign. They'd accumulated wealth and influence that threatened established noble families, creating resentment that would prove fatal for the young king. Palace records reveal the speed with which events unfolded. Edward IV died on April 9, 1483. By April 14, Richard of Gloucester had intercepted Edward IV's journey to London and taken control of the boy's household. Within days, key Woodville supporters were arrested or fled the country, leaving the 12-year-old king completely isolated from anyone who might protect his interests. The boy who entered London in May 1483 was already a prisoner, though he didn't know it yet. Witnesses described Edward IV as small for his age but carrying himself with dignity during his initial public appearances. He'd been well educated and understood royal protocol, but his tutors had never taught him how to recognize when his own family members were planning his destruction. Contemporary chronicles mention Edward's growing anxiety as his coronation was repeatedly postponed. The boy reportedly asked why the ceremony was being delayed and when he would be allowed to leave the tower. These questions went unanswered because Richard had already decided that Edward V would never be crowned, never rule, and never leave the tower alive. Richard of Gloucester moved against his 12-year-old nephew with the precision of someone who'd been planning this moment for months, possibly years. As Lord Protector, Richard held legal authority over Edward V, but that wasn't enough. He needed the boy completely eliminated from succession. The first step was undermining Edward's legitimacy. Richard's supporters suddenly produced evidence of a supposed pre-contract between Edward IV and Eleanor Butler, which would have made Edward's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville invalid. If this claim were true, all of Edward IV's children would be bastards with no right to the throne. The timing was suspiciously convenient, and no one had mentioned this alleged pre-contract during Edward IV's 22-year reign. But legitimacy questions alone wouldn't secure Richard's position. Living bastards could still challenge his rule, especially if they had supporters willing to restore them to power. Edward IV and his younger brother Richard represented permanent threats to Richard's kingship, and medieval politics had little tolerance for loose ends. Richard's consolidation of power accelerated after Edward IV was placed in the tower. Key officials who might have supported the young king found themselves arrested on fabricated charges or simply disappear from historical records. The speed and thoroughness of these eliminations suggest planning that began well before Edward IV's death. Historical accounts describe Richard's behavior during this period as increasingly paranoid and ruthless. He couldn't trust anyone who had sworn loyalty to Edward IV, which meant eliminating not just the boy himself but anyone who might later seek revenge. The systematic nature of these actions reveals someone who understood that half measures would leave him vulnerable to future challenges. By June 1483, Richard had assembled Parliament to formally declare Edward IV and his brother illegitimate. The same assembly then offered Richard the crown, which he accepted with apparent reluctance. But parliamentary declarations couldn't erase the biological reality that Edward IV was Edward IV's eldest son, and many people would never accept Richard's claims of illegitimacy. The final solution was permanent removal. Edward IV had to die, and his death had to appear natural or accidental to avoid creating a martyr. The methods used, likely starvation or suffocation, were chosen precisely because they left minimal evidence and could be explained away as illness if questions arose later. Richard's ascension was complete, but it came at the cost of murdering children who had trusted him. A 12-year-old boy walked through the gates of the Tower of London in May 1483, expecting to prepare for his coronation as England's king. He never walked out again. Edward V and his 9-year-old brother Richard vanished without a trace from the most secure fortress in England, and their disappearance would become one of history's most chilling unsolved mysteries. The Tower of London wasn't a prison for Edward and Richard. Not at first. For centuries, monarchs had stayed in the royal apartments before their coronations. The massive stone walls and armed guards weren't meant to keep them in, but to keep threats out. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, presented their lodging as protective custody while he organized Edward's coronation. The boys moved into the Garden Tower, later renamed the Bloody Tower for reasons that would become horrifically clear. Contemporary accounts describe the princes playing in the tower's gardens during their early weeks there. They practiced archery, attended prayers, and received visits from their attendants. Edward, despite being only 12, carried himself with royal dignity, while his younger brother Richard remained cheerful and energetic. Palace staff reported seeing them at the tower's windows, sometimes waving to crowds gathered outside who hoped to glimpse their future king. But something changed as summer progressed. The boys' appearances at windows became less frequent. Their attendants were gradually dismissed and replaced with men loyal to their uncle, Dr. John Argentine. Edward's physician was one of the last outsiders to see the young king alive. He reported that Edward had grown melancholy and spent hours in prayer, as if he feared for his life. The doctor described a boy who sensed his doom approaching but remained powerless to prevent it. By mid-July 1483, reliable sightings of the princes had stopped entirely. The tower's massive walls, once their protection, had become their tomb. Guards who had served the royal family for years were replaced with Richard's men, and a curtain of silence descended over the fortress. The boys who had entered as king and prince were now invisible to the outside world. The tower's layout made the perfect crime possible. The Garden Tower, where the princes were housed, sat isolated within the fortress's inner ward. Multiple walls and checkpoints separated it from the outside world, and every person who entered or left required authorization from the constable of the tower, who answered directly to Richard. If someone wanted to make 2 children disappear forever, they couldn't have chosen a better location. What makes the tower evidence so damning is the complete absence of any official explanation for the boys' disappearance. No announcement of illness, no record of their transfer to another location, no documentation of their deaths. For 2 of the most important people in England to simply vanish without paperwork or witnesses required a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government. The silence itself became the strongest proof that something terrible had happened within those stone walls. The medieval mind understood what this silence meant. When kings died, even unexpectedly, their deaths were announced with ceremony and mourning. When princes fell ill, physicians were summoned and prayers were offered publicly. The complete absence of information about Edward and Richard's fate told the story more clearly than any confession ever could. Most historians who study the princes' disappearance reach the same grim conclusion: they were murdered. But the method of their killing remains a subject of dark speculation that has persisted for over 5 centuries. The most widely accepted theory suggests they were smothered in their beds, probably while they slept, to avoid struggle or screaming that might alert guards not involved in the conspiracy. Sir Thomas More's account, written decades later, provides the most detailed description of the alleged murders. According to More, Richard III sent Sir James Tyrrell to the tower with orders to kill the boys. Tyrrell supposedly enlisted 2 men, Miles Forrest and John Dighton, to carry out the actual deed. Moore describes how the assassins waited until the children were asleep, then pressed pillows over their faces until they suffocated. The account is vivid and specific, but Moore wasn't present during the events he describes, and his source for these details remains unknown. Another theory suggests the princes were starved to death, a method that would leave no obvious wounds and could be disguised as natural illness. This approach would have been particularly cruel, as it would have taken days or weeks to kill 2 healthy children. Some historians point to this as evidence of Richard's calculated cruelty, arguing that he wanted his nephews to suffer before they died. The starvation theory gained some support from Dr. Argentine's description of Edward's declining condition before he disappeared from public view. The smothering accounts vary in their details, but they share common elements that suggest they might be based on genuine information passed down through witnesses. Multiple sources describe the killers as being reluctant to carry out the deed, suggesting they weren't professional assassins but ordinary men forced into an extraordinary crime. This reluctance could explain why details of the murders eventually leaked. Men haunted by what they'd done might have confessed to priests or family members. Physical evidence supporting the murder theories remains frustratingly scarce. The Tower of London has been continuously occupied and modified for over 500 years, making archaeological investigation nearly impossible. Any physical traces of the crime, bloodstains, disturbed flooring, or hastily constructed hiding places have long since been destroyed by renovation and reconstruction. But the circumstantial evidence forms a compelling case. Richard had clear motives for wanting his nephews dead. They represented permanent threats to his claim to the throne. He had opportunity, controlling access to the boys through his position as Lord Protector. And he had the means, commanding the loyalty of men who could carry out the murders and dispose of the bodies without detection. The timing of the disappearance also supports the murder theories. The boys vanished just as Richard was consolidating his power and preparing for his own coronation. Killing them at this moment would eliminate any possibility of a rescue attempt or rebellion in their favor. The murders, if they occurred, were calculated political acts designed to secure Richard's throne permanently. What haunts historians most about these theories is they involve the deliberate killing of children for political gain. Even in an age when royal murders were common, the targeting of boys so young shocked contemporaries and continues to disturb modern researchers. The princes weren't adult rivals who posed immediate military threats. They were children whose only crime was being born into the wrong family at the wrong time. In 1674, nearly 2 centuries after the princes vanished, workmen renovating a staircase in the Tower of London made a discovery that sent shockwaves through the royal court. Buried beneath the stairs of the White Tower, they found a wooden box containing the skeletons of 2 children. The bones were small, delicate, and appeared to have belonged to boys roughly matching the ages of Edward V and his brother Richard when they disappeared. King Charles II, ruling at the time of the discovery, immediately ordered the bones to be treated as royal remains. Without any scientific examination beyond visual inspection, he declared them to be the lost princes and commanded that they be given a proper burial. The skeletons were placed in a marble urn designed by Christopher Wren and interred in Westminster Abbey, where they remain today in the Henry VII Chapel. The location of the discovery seemed to support the theory that the bones belonged to the princes. The White Tower's staircase would have been an ideal hiding place for someone trying to conceal evidence of murder. The stone steps could be removed and replaced without obvious signs of disturbance, and the location was within the tower's most secure area, accessible only to those with the highest authority. But the 1674 discovery raises as many questions as it answers. The workmen who found the bones left no detailed records of their condition or exact position. We don't know if the skeletons were complete, if they showed signs of violence, or if any personal items were buried with them. The lack of documentation from the discovery makes it impossible to draw definitive conclusions about what the bones actually proved. In 1933, the bones were briefly examined by medical experts, but the investigation was limited and inconclusive. The examination confirmed that the remains belonged to 2 children, one approximately 10 years old and another roughly 12 to 13 years old. These ages roughly correspond to Richard and Edward's ages at the time of their disappearance, but the dating methods available in 1933 weren't precise enough to definitively place the deaths in the 1480s. The 1933 examination did reveal some intriguing details. One skull showed what appeared to be a stain that could have been caused by suffocation, potentially supporting the smothering theories. However, the examiner noted that the stain could have resulted from natural decomposition or environmental factors over centuries of burial. The evidence was suggestive but not conclusive. Modern forensic science could potentially solve the mystery of the bones' identity, but the royal family and Westminster Abbey have consistently refused requests for DNA testing. The Church of England's position is that the bones have been consecrated as royal remains and should not be disturbed for scientific investigation. This decision has frustrated historians and forensic experts who believe that genetic analysis could definitively determine whether the bones belong to the princes. The refusal to allow scientific testing has itself become part of the mystery. Critics argue that if the royal family and church authorities were confident the bones belonged to Edward and Richard, they would welcome DNA analysis that could prove it. The resistance. You've been told that history is written by victors, But what happens when the victors deliberately fabricate the story? The death of 12-year-old Edward V wasn't documented by anyone who actually witnessed it. Instead, every single account you've ever read was written years later by men who had powerful reasons to lie. Sir Thomas More's account reads like a horror novel, not a historical record. He describes the princes being smothered with pillows and feather beds pressed against their faces until they suffocated. Moore claims their murderers then buried the bodies at the foot of some stairs, deep under a great heap of stones. The narrative is vivid, detailed, and completely fabricated. Moore was writing decades after the supposed murders, during the reign of Henry VIII, when demonizing Richard III served the Tudor dynasty perfectly. Moore never met Richard III. He was 5 years old when Richard died at Bosworth Field. Yet his account became the definitive version of events, copied and repeated by historians for centuries. The chancellor who wrote this dramatic tale was crafting propaganda, not recording history. Every gruesome detail about suffocation, every description of the boy's final moments came from Moore's imagination, not eyewitness testimony. Dominic Mancini offers a different but equally suspect narrative. This Italian chronicler claimed Edward V was seen less and less frequently at the tower's windows until he vanished entirely. Mancini suggests the boy was kept in increasingly squalid conditions, implying death by neglect or starvation. But Mancini left England in July 1483, before Edward V supposedly died. His account relies on rumors and speculation, not direct observation. Both chroniclers wrote under the Tudor regime, when blackening Richard III's reputation was politically essential. Henry VII had killed Richard and seized the throne, but his claim to kingship was extraordinarily weak. The disappeared princes became the perfect justification for Henry's coup. Dead children make excellent propaganda tools, and the Tudors wielded Edward V's fate like a weapon against Richard's memory. The problem runs deeper than individual bias. No contemporary source from Richard's actual reign mentions the princes' deaths. No royal announcement, no court records, no diplomatic correspondence acknowledges their murder. The boys simply vanished from historical record, and their deaths were retroactively inserted into history by Tudor propagandists. Palace records show payments for the prince's food and clothing through the summer of 1483, then nothing. But this silence proves nothing about murder. It could indicate the boys were moved, hidden, or died of disease. The absence of evidence became twisted into evidence of massacre, but only after the Tudors needed it to be. Henry Tudor's rise to power required Richard III to be a child-killing monster. The Battle of Bosworth in 1485 wasn't just a military victory, it was the beginning of a centuries-long character assassination. Richard died fighting, unable to defend himself against accusations that hadn't even been made yet. The transformation of Edward V's disappearance into definitive murder happened gradually, through repetition of unverified claims. Each Tudor chronicler built upon the last, adding details and certainty where none existed. By the time Shakespeare wrote Richard III, the hunchbacked child killer had become historical fact, not political fiction. Henry VII faced a crucial problem after Bosworth. His genealogical claim to the throne was laughably weak, traced through illegitimate lines and dubious marriages. But if Richard III was a proven regicide, then Henry's violent coup became a righteous crusade to avenge murdered children. Dead princes justified living usurpers. The accusations against Richard III spread throughout Europe, carried by Tudor diplomats and merchants. Foreign courts heard detailed accounts of the prince's murders, accounts that grew more elaborate with each telling. Henry VII's ambassadors weren't just conducting diplomacy, they were conducting psychological warfare against a dead king's reputation. The Tudor propaganda machine worked with devastating efficiency. Every court appointment, every church sermon, every historical commission reinforced the narrative of Richard the child killer. Opposing voices were systematically silenced or marginalized. Within a generation, questioning Richard's guilt became tantamount to treason against the Tudor dynasty. Parliament retroactively declared Richard III's reign illegitimate, branding him a usurper and tyrant. This wasn't historical analysis, but political necessity. The Tudors needed Richard to be evil to justify their own actions. Edward V's supposed murder became the cornerstone of Tudor legitimacy. Repeated so often it hardened into unquestionable truth. The irony cuts deep. Henry VII, who actually did kill a crowned king on a battlefield, successfully branded his victim as the murderer. Richard III, who may never have harmed his nephews, became history's most notorious child killer. The real killer buried his crime under accusations of fictional murders, and the lie outlived everyone who knew the truth. The mystery of Edward V's fate created a cottage industry of imposters and pretenders. When someone vanishes without explanation, others inevitably emerge claiming to be them. The most famous was Perkin Warbeck, who spent nearly a decade insisting he was Richard, Duke of York, Edward V's younger brother. Warbeck's story captivated Europe. He claimed to have escaped the Tower, been hidden by loyal supporters, and grown up in exile. His physical appearance convinced several foreign courts, and he gained backing from enemies of Henry VII across the continent. The King of Scotland married Warbeck to a noblewoman, treating him as legitimate English royalty, but Warbeck's tale contained fatal flaws and contradictions. He claimed to remember details about the Yorkist court that could have been learned from any number of exiled supporters. When pressed for specific childhood memories or family secrets, his answers remained frustratingly vague. Most damning, he couldn't speak English without a pronounced foreign accent, hardly credible for an English prince. Henry VII initially dismissed Warbeck as an obvious fraud, but the pretender's persistence and international support became genuinely threatening. Foreign backing for a supposed Yorkist heir could destabilize Tudor rule and reignite the Wars of the Roses. Henry was forced to take military action against someone he knew to be an impostor, purely because others believed the lie. The Warbeck affair reveals how thoroughly the prince's disappearance had poisoned English politics. The absence of bodies created space for fantasies and wishful thinking. Yorkist supporters, desperate to believe their cause wasn't truly dead, convinced themselves that at least one prince had survived. Hope became delusion, and delusion became international conspiracy. Other pretenders emerged throughout Henry VII's reign, each claiming to be a missing Yorkist prince or heir. Some genuinely believed their own stories, victims of mental illness or false memories. Others were knowing fraudsters, exploiting the information vacuum surrounding the prince's fate. All were symptoms of the same problem. Unresolved mystery breeds dangerous myths. The pretender phenomenon extended far beyond England's borders. European courts, eager to destabilize Henry VII, welcomed any plausible Yorkist claimant. The Holy Roman Emperor, the French king, and various Italian princes all hosted supposed English princes at different times. Edward V's disappearance became a tool of international diplomacy, with foreign powers using pretenders to pressure Tudor England. The tragic reality is that these impostors often suffered genuine anguish about their identities. Warbeck may have convinced himself he really was Richard of York, creating elaborate false memories to support his claim. The psychological toll of performing another person's life for years likely damaged these men irreparably. Henry VII's response to the pretenders was ruthlessly effective. He captured Warbeck, forced him to confess publicly to being an impostor, then executed him anyway. The message was clear: claiming Yorkist identity meant death, whether the claim was genuine or fraudulent. The Tudor dynasty would tolerate no ambiguity about royal succession. The myths surrounding Edward V refused to die even after the pretenders were eliminated. Romantic legends emerged about the princes escaping to distant lands, living peaceful lives under assumed names. These stories offered comfort to those who couldn't accept that two innocent children had been murdered for political convenience. Modern conspiracy theories continue this pattern, with amateur historians proposing elaborate scenarios for the prince's survival. DNA analysis of the bones found in the Tower could resolve the question definitively, but the Church of England has consistently refused to authorize testing. The mystery remains officially unsolvable, deliberately preserved by institutional reluctance to disturb ancient remains. History loves to point fingers at Richard III, but what if we've been looking at the wrong killer this entire time? 5 centuries of accusations might have missed the real murderer walking free through the pages of our textbooks. Henry Tudor had everything to gain from 2 dead princes. Before he became Henry VII, he was just another pretender scrambling for legitimacy. Those boys represented living, breathing obstacles to his throne. Contemporary records show Henry's agents were already operating in London months before Bosworth Field. The man who would later execute every possible rival to secure his dynasty certainly possessed the ruthlessness to eliminate 2 children. Yet historians consistently overlook this possibility because Henry won the crown and got to write the official story. Then there's Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, Richard's supposed ally who turned rebel. Palace insiders knew Buckingham harbored his own royal ambitions through his Plantagenet bloodline. The Duke had unprecedented access to the Tower and commanded the loyalty of key guards. When Buckingham launched his failed rebellion in October 1483, he desperately needed those princes alive to legitimize his cause. Their continued absence suggests they were already dead by his hand, eliminated when they refused to support his treasonous plans. Some scholars propose the princes never died violently at all. Medieval child mortality rates were catastrophic, especially in the damp, unsanitary conditions of the tower. Disease could have claimed both boys within weeks of each other. Sweating sickness, typhus, or plague regularly swept through London's confined spaces. Richard III might have concealed their natural deaths to avoid appearing cursed by God or incompetent as protector. The most persistent alternative theory suggests one or both princes escaped. Supporters point to Perkin Warbeck, who convinced European courts he was the younger prince, Richard of York. Warbeck knew intimate details about the royal family that would have been impossible for a commoner to learn. His physical resemblance to the Yorkist line was striking enough to fool experienced diplomats. Though Henry VII eventually captured and executed him, questions remain about whether the real prince died on that scaffold. Archaeological evidence further complicates the narrative. Those bones discovered in 1674 have never undergone modern forensic analysis. The 1933 examination was primitive by today's standards, relying on visual assessment rather than scientific dating or DNA testing. The remains could belong to any children who died in the tower across centuries of use. Royal officials continue blocking requests for comprehensive testing, fueling speculation they fear results that might overturn accepted history. Each theory suffers from the same fatal flaw that has plagued this mystery for 500 years. Contemporary sources were either destroyed, suppressed, or written by people with political agendas. The Tudors spent decades systematically eliminating records that might contradict their version of events. What survives has been filtered through generations of royal propaganda designed to justify Henry VII's seizure of power. The truth probably lies buried somewhere between these competing narratives. Multiple parties had motives to kill the princes. Several possessed the means and opportunity. The absence of definitive evidence allows each theory to flourish while none can be proven conclusively. More than 5 centuries have passed since 2 young boys vanished into the shadows of the Tower of London, yet their fate continues to elude historians, archaeologists, and investigators. Every piece of evidence we uncover seems to raise more questions than it answers. What makes this mystery so enduring isn't just the lack of concrete evidence. It's the way each generation has projected its own fears and assumptions onto these long-dead children. The Tudors needed them to be victims of Richard III's tyranny. The Victorians romanticized them as innocent martyrs. Modern historians debate their fate with the same passion as contemporary political scandals. The 1674 bone discovery should have ended the speculation. Instead, it created new controversies that persist today. Without modern forensic analysis, we can't even confirm those remains belong to the princes. The refusal of authorities to authorize comprehensive testing only deepens the mystery. What are they afraid of discovering? Perhaps Richard III did order their murders to secure his throne. Perhaps Henry Tudor eliminated them before his own coronation. Perhaps they died from disease, accident, or the actions of ambitious nobles seeking to manipulate the succession. Perhaps one or both survived the tower and lived anonymous lives far from the deadly game of royal politics. The lack of resolution reflects a broader truth about medieval power structures. Kings, nobles, and ambitious men routinely eliminated rivals without leaving convenient confession letters for future historians. Violence was a political tool, and children offered no special protection from its application. We want clear villains and innocent victims because it makes sense of a senseless world. These weren't just 2 royal children who disappeared. They were symbols of legitimate authority in an age when bloodline determined everything. Their fate shaped English history in ways we're still discovering. Richard III's reputation suffered irreparable damage whether he was guilty or innocent. Henry VII's dynasty gained legitimacy from their absence. The entire Tudor narrative of good versus evil was built on their empty graves. Modern techniques could potentially solve aspects of this mystery. DNA analysis of the Westminster Abbey bones could confirm their identity. Ground-penetrating radar might locate additional remains in the tower. Documentary analysis using artificial intelligence could uncover patterns in surviving records that human researchers have missed. Yet part of us doesn't want answers. The mystery of the princes in the tower embodies something essential about the medieval world: its casual brutality, its political machinations, its utter disregard for innocent life. Solving it might strip away that dark fascination with an age when power truly corrupted absolutely. 2 boys entered the Tower of London in 1483. They never emerged. Everything else remains speculation, theory, and educated guesswork. Their story endures precisely because it lacks an ending. In a world obsessed with closure, the princes in the tower remind us that some secrets die with their keepers. History's greatest mysteries aren't puzzles waiting to be solved. They're wounds that